He now used the power given to him by the fear of the terror spread by the Red Guards to dispose of party comrades who were critical of his dictatorial regime.
In October 1966, the Cultural Revolution switched its objectives. From now on, its main focus was directed more and more against leaders within the party. So the movement was becoming increasingly opposed to party institutions. In this way, the fundamental organizational principles of the state were being questioned. Mao had deliberately made provisions for this. He was hoping that new forms of political organization might emerge, which would then enable him to keep the revolution going.
Troublesome officials were arbitrarily accused of being revisionist, political thieves, or spies. The witch hunt drove some party members to suicide. Many were arrested or disappeared without trace. Liu Shaoqi was also toppled and died in prison.
It was some of the same leaders, but most of the original leaders were no longer there. More than a majority of the original Central Committee were overthrown. Of the original leaders, only ones left, besides Mao, were Zhou Enlai, Mao's secretary, Chen Boda, Kang Sung, maybe one or two others. The rest were all gone.
By October 1968, two-thirds of the Central Committee had fallen victim to the political purging. Mao had triumphed.
Violence was common. It was about life or death. And Mao was absolutely ruthless, of course, when power was involved. He might not perhaps have been physically involved himself, but he did stir things up and let things run that led to violence. He was an out-and-out power seeker. He always knew which people to use to consolidate certain power structures and to back him and protect him.
They included his wife, Jiang Qing, an ardent supporter of the Cultural Revolution. Mao had achieved his goal. The reformers had been neutralized, and he himself was again at the center of the action. The great chairman no longer needed his young pioneers. Many of his supporters were disappointed in Mao.
I thought this was the most worthwhile thing possible. I did everything possible to support them. And I didn't realize, of course, that Mao was using them as a battering ram to overthrow his opposition. And when he found that he could not control the young people, he just sent them out to work in the villages, and that was the end of it.
The party sent 5 million young people out into the provinces to work on the land, together with several million cadres who were forced to work in rural regions. In this way, Mao solved two social problems with one move, that of the former Red Guards and their former victims.
The program that involved sending Red Guards into the countryside began in late autumn 1968, and for many it even lasted until 1980. Basically, it meant that the mass phase of the Cultural Revolution was over. The Red Guards had served their mobilizing function. Mao was displeased that in no way had they managed to amalgamate and create new forms of political organization. Instead, they had mainly become involved in minor disputes. So he felt it was now time for the Red Guards to be re-educated through work on the land, to learn what revolution really meant. Thus, the Cultural Revolution, in a classical sense, was over.
Although it was initially an urban phenomenon, the Cultural Revolution had also changed life radically for the peasants. First and foremost, they found the new arrivals to be a burden, a lost generation which characterizes China even today.
People felt that they were building a better world, that Mao was against bureaucracy, against stagnation, against inequality between officials and ordinary people, and they were going to do away with all that. The students did away with examinations. Who's not in favor of that? And of course it ruined the educational system for 10 years. And there's a whole generation, that whole generation that lost their education.
The Cultural Revolution left behind a traumatized nation. Denunciation had become the most effective instrument of Mao's rule. Now, no one in China trusted anyone else. Everything was geared towards veneration of the great helmsman who continued to have himself celebrated with colossal parades. All Mao saw in his people was a mass to be guided, and himself as the new emperor of China.
He was openly saying that China needs an emperor figure, and that of course was him. That to lead all these hundreds of millions of country people, they had to have a figure of imperial authority. Of course, in his mind, he associated his own power with carrying the revolution forward. He was going to liberate all mankind, but in fact, it was power.
Meanwhile, tensions on China's border with the Soviet Union were threatening to escalate. In March 1969, an island in the Ussuri, a river that forms part of the Sino-Russian border, became a bone of contention between the two nuclear powers. There had already been repeated minor incidents there in the past.
In the late 60s, Mao realistically saw the danger of a war with the Soviet Union. He'd already calculated that Russia might attack China with nuclear weapons. In fact, he'd already evacuated elements of the party leadership because he saw the threat as imminent. Mao tried to take the sting out of the conflict through rapprochement with the other superpower.
After the collision on the border, which had been triggered by China, Moscow threatened to retaliate. Together with Alexei Kosygin, Zhou Enlai managed to officially suppress the conflict, but tensions continued to smolder. Now the Chinese leadership began to turn to the other major nuclear power.
Naturally, China's breach with the Soviet Union led to the Chinese thinking about a possible alternative ally to Moscow. They had certainly seen America as a counterweight to the Soviet Union, and secondly, its huge economic potential, which they wanted to make use of. Even today, Chinese communism is characterized not so much by clinging to dogmas as by the search for whatever can be useful to the country. The ideology is then altered a little to meet these requirements.
Dann passt man ein bisschen die Ideologie diesen Erfordernissen an.
Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai was just the right man for such a change of course. On April 14, 1971, this cosmopolitan figure gave the first press conference in Beijing to which foreign journalists were also invited. The occasion was a visit by the United States table tennis team. In the course of the discussions, the Chinese premier adopted a surprisingly benevolent tone towards the US delegation.
They have been cut off for a long time, but now, with your exception of the invitation that we extended to you to come to China this time, we have opened a new page in the relations of the Chinese and American people. And I am confident that this beginning again of our friendship between our two people will certainly meet with the approval and support of the great majority of our two people, and want to seek for the truth.
The premier was one of the most respected and popular politicians in China.
Zhou Enlai was, if you like, always the good face of Chinese communism. This was partly because he was extremely charming and cosmopolitan and could move with great skill in diplomatic circles. He was also highly reliable and worked incredibly hard. If you look at his work diaries and see what he accomplished, you wonder when he ever slept. What tends to be forgotten is that Zhu actually participated in all of Mao's major political decisions and also implemented them responsibly in a wide variety of forms.
Mao Zedongs mitgetragen hat und in vielfältigster Form auch verantwortlich durchgeführt hat.
In summer, Zhou Enlai established contact with Henry Kissinger, the US president's security advisor. America was also looking for allies against the Soviet Union. Together, the two men agreed on a visit to Beijing by President Richard Nixon. When, in February 1972, he became the first US head of state to set foot on Chinese soil, it was Zhou who received him, because Mao, the great chairman, now 78 years old, was seriously ill.
Mao Zedong ist zu dieser Phase gesundheitlich relativ stark.
At the time, Mao Zedong was in very poor health.
Also ein förmlicher Austausch, der hier stattfindet.
Basically, it was a formal exchange which took place here, because the main talks were held between Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger. But even so, at least for the Chinese public, it was a difficult change of course to explain. The big upheavals which occurred in the early 70s in both foreign and domestic policy caused considerable doubt in the sincerity of the respective political lines, and thus mistrust in the ideology as such. That also went a long way to preparing the way for what today we know as reform politics.
Auch ganz maßgeblich dann überhaupt das vor, was wir heute als Reformpolitik kennen.
Mao's wife, Chiang Ching, was opposed to any type of reform. Nevertheless, in perfect publicity style, she received the leader of the West in her own environment, the Chinese opera. After Mao's death, she tried in vain to seize power as part of the so-called Gang of Four and reverse the reforms that had been introduced and prevent the country from opening up to the West. This rapprochement with the state's former number one enemy was also very hard to explain to the rest of the Chinese people.
Wenn ich eine bestimmte Öffnung will, Technologie.
When I want a certain opening to promote technology and the economy, I also import ideologies. I need certain forms of behavior. This, of course, undoubtedly involves a great potential for conflict. But Mao had the skill and the strength, and he was needed for this. The pictures of Mao and Nixon went around the world. Thus, the Cold War with China was over. In autumn 1972, the People's Republic of China was recognized by the Federal Republic of Germany.
Damals hat China im Herbst 72 anerkannt.
When Federal German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and his wife Loki paid their respects in 1975, Mao's doctors had already diagnosed an incurable nervous disease. Schmidt said later that he had met a wreck. His chin hung down, his mouth was open, his face was derelict. But even so, the ping-pong diplomacy between the United States and China produced some permanent successes. The aged dictator built up his influence abroad and, for instance, supported the terror regime of the Khmer Rouge.
Maos Gesundheit verschlechtert sich vor allem ab 1974.
From 1974-75, Mao's health deteriorated rapidly. It's not that he handed over the reins of power. However, he had increasing difficulty making himself understood. In the end, it was only his nurse who could use sign language or some other form in order to make his utterances understandable.
Als Torwächterin hier fungiert.
At times, Mao only expressed himself in written form. He would write short notes and in this way pass on any political instructions. But we can assume that before his death he was still politically awake and influential.
Aber man kann schon davon ausgehen, dass bis kurz vor seinem
So the reins of power were still in his hands.
und einflussreich geblieben ist und daher nicht die Zügel aus der Hand gegeben hat.
After 3 heart attacks, Mao Zedong passed away on September 9, 1976, at the age of 82. His body went on display in the Great Hall of the People. Thousands dutifully paid their final respects to the great helmsman. Because of poor embalming, Mao's corpse had shrunk. But at the funeral, neither his widow, Jiang Qing, nor the other loyal participants showed any reaction. Even in death, the great chairman remained untouchable. Even today, the Chinese Communist Party still reveres Mao Zedong as a great revolutionary, philosopher and leading statesman, even though he was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 70 million people.
His great sin was that after coming to power, I think he gradually became obsessed with power. And he launched these great social experiments, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, without having any idea of what was going to happen. He thought that he had the right to launch these experiments. And millions of people died as a result, tens of millions.
It could well be that to a certain extent, the hysterical weeping at the funeral of the magnificent leader was arranged. For many Chinese, Mao Zedong's death was more of a liberation. But for many, it also meant the end of an era, the end of a revolutionary who had made a new life possible for them.
Steht dafür in seiner
He embodies the success that China was united. He stands for the fact that people had bread and education, for the emancipation of women, and for a whole lot more. And for many, especially the older generation, he personally meant incredible progress.
Sehr persönlich bedeutet einen unglaublichen Fortschritt.
But this progress soon fell victim to Mao's megalomania. He had subjected China to 10 years of chaos. The great chairman had ruthlessly sacrificed an entire generation in order to defend his autocratic claim to power. The decade of terror still marks the country even today. And today too, critics in China are still silenced.
Even today, the Cultural Revolution still characterizes China in many ways. Since there has never been any social discussion of exactly what happened, many of the old lines of conflict still exist. Amongst other things, for instance, there are powerful left-wing forces, some of whom are calling for a return to phases of the Cultural Revolution. Nor has there been any real study made of the perpetrators and victims of the time. We see this in totally practical matters, how simply political communication takes place, how dissidents are treated. All these things characterize Chinese society even today.
No other communist leader, not even Stalin, stood as much at the center of a personal cult as the Son of Heaven Mao Zedong. Even today, he is present everywhere in the People's Republic of China. His portrait over the gate to the Square of Heavenly Peace is seen as the hallmark of the country. And that is something even the millions of human lives the dictator cost will not change so quickly.